Hey guys, welcome aboard to Snoozy Voyager, and tonight we are doing something truly historic. Something so baffling, so cosmically absurd, that historians still bring it up at dinner parties, just to watch people's faces. Tonight, we are talking about the Great Emu War. Yes, a war against emus, fought by the Australian military in 1932 with actual machine guns. The emus won. Before we get into it, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somehow it is always somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, and someone is always half asleep watching a video about flightless birds defeating a government. That is the Snoozy Voyager audience, and I love every single one of you. Now dim those lights, crack a window, turn on a fan for that soft white noise and get yourself horizontal. Tuck in your feet, pull up your blanket. You are safe. The emus cannot reach you here. Let's just pause for a second and really sit with some questions. Have you ever stared down the barrel of a project at work and thought, this is not going to go well? Now imagine that project was a military campaign against 600-pound birds that can run at 30 miles per hour and feel no pain and just keep walking toward you. Did the Australian soldiers try to negotiate first? Did anyone in the government read a single sentence about emus before greenlit the whole operation? What does it feel like to fire a machine gun at a bird and have the bird simply look at you? Could you, personally, survive a single morning in the Australian outback in 1932? Heat, dust, no air conditioning, and 10,000 emus bearing down on you like they have a meeting to get to. Congratulations. You've just woken up in Western Australia. The year is 1932. It is already 40 degrees. The ground is cracked. Something enormous is standing on the horizon, staring at you with the dead, confident eyes of a creature that has survived 66 million years and has absolutely no plans to stop. Good luck. Let's start at the beginning, which means we need to talk about the emu. Not the concept of the emu, not the cartoon version of the emu, the actual real living emu standing in front of you right now in the Western Australian wheat fields, roughly as tall as your chest, with a beak like a blunt instrument and eyes that contain not a single coherent thought. The emu is the second largest bird on the planet. It cannot fly. It can run at speeds up to 30 miles per hour. It has a rudimentary secondary eyelid. It has been on this earth in roughly its current form since before the dinosaurs finished dying. And in 1932, approximately 20,000 of them decided to migrate directly into the farmland of the Campion district and eat everything. You need to understand the scale of what 20,000 emus actually looks like, because your brain wants to shrink it into something manageable. It is not manageable. Picture the largest crowd you've ever stood in, a stadium, a concert, a very bad airport, and now replace every single person with a bird that stands 5 feet tall, weighs over 100 pounds, and has absolutely no concept of personal space or property boundaries. Now picture that crowd moving, slowly, steadily, across your wheat fields, through your fences, around your dams, stopping to eat things, just eating everything, not maliciously, not strategically, just eating, the way something eats when it is very large and very hungry, and the food is simply there. The emu is not a stupid animal exactly, but it is not a clever one either. It operates on instinct, and its instincts are very old and very good. It knows where water is. It knows where food is. It can smell rain from extraordinary distances. It migrates in response to rainfall patterns, following invisible routes across the landscape that its ancestors established millions of years before any human arrived on this continent. It does not understand fences as boundaries. It understands fences as mild inconveniences, which is a distinction that the farmers of Western Australia were about to learn in the most expensive way possible. An emu fence, you should know, is not the same as Say, a fence for sheep. A sheep encounters a fence and considers it final. An emu encounters a fence and leans into it, applies its considerable body weight in a slow, persistent, basically geological way, and eventually the fence gives, or it finds a weak point, or it simply walks through a gap that seemed too small for something its size until somehow it wasn't. The farmers had rabbit-proof fencing, designed to keep out animals considerably smaller than emus, and the emus treated it like a suggestion. By the time the migration was in full force, the damage to crops in the Campion district was severe enough that farmers were watching an already desperate year become catastrophic. These were men farming in the middle of the Great Depression, in semi-arid land with no guarantee of rain and no guarantee of prices. They had built these farms out of government land grants after the First World War. They had been told, farm this, and it is yours, and it will be worth something, and they had farmed it. And now 20,000 emus were walking through it. The emu did not know it had started a war. The emu was hungry. The emu had found food. From the emu's perspective, things were going extremely well. You are a wheat farmer in Western Australia in 1932, which means your life is already a catalogue of misery before a single emu shows up. The Great Depression has collapsed grain prices. The government promised you subsidies and has not delivered them. You came out here, many of you as veterans of the First World War, because the government offered you land if you would farm it. You farmed it. You built something from nothing in one of the most hostile landscapes on the continent. And now, on top of the drought and the debt and the government's broken promises, the emus have arrived. Tens of thousands of them, moving through your crops like a slow, feathered flood, eating your wheat, tearing down your rabbit fencing, looking at you with absolutely no remorse. You write to the government. You ask for help. Specifically, you ask for soldiers. Your morning begins before dawn, the way mornings always begin when you have no choice. You dress in the dark, drink something that passes for coffee, and step outside into air that is already warm even at this hour, because the Australian outback does not really have a cool part of the day, so much as a slightly less scalding part of the day. You walk your property and assess the damage from the night before. There is always damage. The emus move at night and at dawn, and they do not knock. You find the places where the fencing has been pushed down, again, and you note the wheat that has been eaten, and you note the wheat that has been trampled, which is somehow worse because at least eaten wheat was useful to something. Trampled wheat is just loss. You have been writing letters. You have been writing letters for months, the kind of letters that start formal and polite, and gradually, over subsequent drafts, acquire the particular tone of a person who has stopped sleeping properly. You're not asking for much. You're asking for pest control. You used to be a soldier, many of you were. These soldier-settler schemes that the government ran after 1918 were specifically designed to put veterans on the land, and you know that the government has machine guns. You have seen machine guns used. You know what they do. You're suggesting, in your increasingly frank correspondence, that someone point some of them at the emus. The government, to its credit or discredit, depending on how you look at it, eventually agrees. What you asked for was professional assistance. What you're about to receive is the Great Emu War, which will be fought on your land, watched by journalists, debated in Parliament, and discussed by people you have never met for the next 90 years. None of this is what you wanted. You wanted your wheat back. It is worth sitting with who these farmers actually were for a moment. Not abstractions, not background characters, but specific men with specific histories who had already survived one catastrophe and were being asked to survive several more simultaneously. The Depression had cut wheat prices by more than half. Many of them were in debt. Some had already lost everything once. They had come to Western Australia because the promise was that land equaled stability, equaled a future, equaled something solid in a world that had proven itself extremely good at being unstable. The emus were the loudest part of the problem. They were not the only part, but they were the part you could see. Every morning, standing in your field, eating your future with complete serenity. Somewhere in Canberra, in a government office that presumably smelled of pipe tobacco and poor judgment, a decision was made. The farmers wanted military assistance to deal with the emu problem, and the Minister of Defence, the actual Minister of Defence, said yes. The army would be deployed. Soldiers would be sent, and not just soldiers. Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery would lead the campaign, accompanied by 2 other soldiers and 2 Lewis guns, like machine guns left over from the First World War. The plan was straightforward. The plan was, in retrospect, embarrassing. They would herd the emus into a killing field, open fire, and dispatch the lot of them efficiently. This was the plan. The emus had not been informed of the plan, which turned out to be the plan's central flaw. The decision made a certain kind of sense in the room where it was made. You have farmers asking for help. You have a pest problem of genuine scale. You have surplus military equipment and trained soldiers who are frankly not doing much else. The Depression has shrunk the defence budget. The military has guns that need to be used occasionally or they rust. The farmers have a problem that bullets theoretically solve. The logic chain, in a government office in 1932, is not obviously broken. The problems only become obvious once you put the guns in front of the emus, which is the kind of lesson that tends to require the actual emus. Sir George Pearce, the Minister of Defence who authorised the operation, was by most accounts a capable and experienced politician. He had served in government for decades. He understood budgets and logistics and the complicated business of running a country during a depression. He did not fully understand emus. This is not a unique failure. Almost no one in government in 1932 fully understood emus, because until the emu staged what amounted to a full-scale invasion of the Campion district, no one had needed to. The authorization came with certain conditions designed to protect the government's position regardless of outcome. The military was to be present as support for the farmers, not as the primary agents of a pest control operation. The farmers were to be involved. The operation was to be quick and efficient. And this is the detail that would prove most consequential. Journalists were to be invited to observe and document the victory, because the government anticipated a victory and expected good press from it. The press came. They observed. They documented. The documentation was not what anyone had anticipated. What is most striking about the authorization looking back is not that it happened. Governments have made worse decisions under better circumstances, but that no one in the chain of approval appears to have asked the obvious question. What do we know about emus? How do they behave under fire? How large is this migration really? What has been tried before and why has it not worked? These questions were not asked, or if they were asked, the answers were not persuasive enough to stop the process. The process had its own momentum. The farmers had been asking for help for months. The government had finally said yes. The machine guns were being loaded onto trucks. The emus were in a field somewhere, eating wheat, completely unaware that any of this was happening. Before the shooting started, there was the small matter of the landscape. The Campion district of Western Australia is not the kind of place that makes anything easy. It is flat in a way that feels almost personal, like the land itself has given up. The red-brown soil stretches out in every direction under a sky that is extremely large and extremely indifferent. In November, which is when this campaign began, the temperature climbs past 40 degrees Celsius before lunch. The scrub is dry. The dust gets into everything. Your eyes, your water, your machine gun mechanisms, your will to continue. There are flies. There are so many flies that experienced residents of the region have developed a distinctive hand gesture, a slow wave in front of the face that has since become informally known as the Australian salute. You're about to spend several weeks out here. You and your 2 Lewis guns and your increasingly complicated feelings about emus. The Australian outback has a specific quality that people who have not been there tend to underestimate, which is that it is hostile in every direction simultaneously. There is too much sun. There is not enough water. The ground is hard and offers nothing soft to fall on and nothing cool to rest against. The vegetation, what there is of it, consists primarily of low scrub and dry grass and the occasional tree that looks like it is having a difficult time. The distances between things are significant. You're in a place that was not designed with human comfort in mind, and it communicates this clearly at all times. For the soldiers arriving from wherever soldiers arrived. From in 1932, the Campion district presented a logistical environment that their training had not specifically addressed. They knew how to operate the Lewis guns, they knew how to communicate, they knew the chain of command. What they did not know was how to pursue 20,000 large birds across broken ground, in temperatures that made the equipment unreliable, and the men miserable, because this scenario had not appeared in the training manuals. It had not appeared in anyone's training manuals. It was new. The dust was particularly significant. The Lewis gun is a mechanical instrument with many moving parts, and moving parts require lubrication, and lubrication and fine red-brown dust are not compatible in the way that you need them to be when you're trying to shoot emus. The guns jammed. They would continue to jam throughout the operation. Each jam occurred at a moment that felt to the men involved specifically designed by the universe to be maximally inconvenient in the middle of an engagement with emus in range, when a few more seconds of uninterrupted fire might have produced something that looked like a result. The heat was a separate problem. Operating heavy equipment in 40-degree heat while wearing the clothing of a 1932 soldier is not comfortable. Tracking moving targets across a shimmering landscape where the horizon wobbles from heat haze is not easy. Maintaining the kind of focused, precise military professionalism that the operation theoretically required is significantly harder when you're sweating through everything you own and the flies have decided that your face is interesting. The emus, for their part, seemed fine. They had evolved for this landscape. They were, in the truest sense, at home. You were not. Major GPW Meredith was a soldier, a real one. He had served in the First World War. He understood artillery, tactics, logistics, and the grim calculus of military operations. He was, by all accounts, a competent and professional officer. None of this helped him. Meredith arrived in the Campion district in November of 1932 with his 2 men, his 2 Lewis guns, and what appears to have been a reasonable degree of confidence that this would be a brief and decisive operation. He had fought in a world war. He was about to be outwitted by animals whose brains are smaller than their eyeballs. To his enormous credit, Major Meredith would later describe the emus with something approaching genuine admiration, an admiration that was earned through suffering and is somehow the most relatable thing about this entire episode. Meredith's background was in artillery, which is relevant because artillery operates on the principle of overwhelming firepower delivered at range. The Lewis gun, which fires 500 rounds per minute when it's working correctly, seemed like more than adequate overwhelming firepower for the task of clearing emus from a wheat field. This calculation assumed certain things about the emus, that they would be in one place, that they would respond to fire by falling over, and that the operation would have a discernible beginning, middle, and end. These assumptions were not unreasonable. They were simply wrong. The Major was a methodical man. His reports from the field are precise and restrained in tone, written in the clipped language of a professional soldier making the best of circumstances he cannot fully explain without sounding like he is making them up. He notes terrain difficulties. He notes equipment failures. He notes the dispersal behaviour of the emus in language that is technically accurate and somehow also deeply sad. He's trying to explain, in the idiom of military documentation, why the birds are winning and the idiom is not quite adequate to the task. What the reports do not capture, but what the quoted recollections suggest, is that Meredith developed a grudging respect for the emus that went beyond professional assessment. He was a man who had fought in one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, who had seen what machine guns could do to human beings, and he was watching those same machine guns fail to meaningfully inconvenience large birds. This required a recalibration of certain assumptions. He recalibrated. He adapted his tactics. He mounted the guns on trucks. He changed his approach. He did everything a competent officer should do when a situation is not responding to the initial plan. The situation continued to not respond. Later, describing the emus to a journalist, Meredith used the comparison to Zulu warriors, a reference to the legendary physical courage and resistance to injury of Zulu fighters that would have been well understood by his audience. He said it as a compliment. He meant it as a compliment. He had been there. He had watched men fire and watched emus absorb fire and keep moving, and he had arrived at a conclusion that surprised him. The emus were formidable, not intelligent, not strategic, not malicious. Simply formidable in the way that something is formidable when it's very large and very determined and does not understand the concept of retreat. Meredith went home eventually. The emus stayed. The first engagement of the Great Emu War took place on the 2nd of November 1932, and it went badly. The soldiers had located a group of around 50 emus near a dam, which seemed ideal. A large body of birds in a confined area, water behind them, guns in front. Perfect conditions for the kind of efficient, tidy military operation that looks good in a report. They waited until the emus were in range. They opened fire, and then the emus did the thing that emus apparently do. They scattered. Not in a panicked, stumbling, easy-to-shoot way. They scattered in every direction simultaneously, at speed, in small groups, fanning out across the scrub like a feathered dispersal algorithm. By the time the guns fell silent, a handful of emus were dead, and several thousand were somewhere else entirely. The Lewis guns had jammed. The report back to Canberra was not triumphant. You have to picture the scene with some care, because your instinct is to imagine it as chaotic, and it was not chaotic. It was worse than chaotic. Chaos implies random, unpredictable outcomes. What happened at the dam was something more discouraging. It was the predictable outcome of a plan meeting reality, and the reality was winning cleanly. The emus did not panic in a way that helped anyone. They did not pile up or freeze or run in circles. They left, rapidly, in every direction at once. The guns swung after them. The guns jammed. The birds were gone. The first day established several things that would remain true for the duration of the operation. The emus would not concentrate in groups large enough and static enough to be efficiently targeted. The Lewis guns, though powerful, were not suited to the task of shooting multiple, fast-moving targets across open ground while also coping with dust and heat. And the emus seemed to have an almost immediate instinct to put distance between themselves and whatever had just made a very loud noise, which is a reasonable instinct and one that had served them well for several million years before anyone pointed a Lewis gun at them. The journalists who were present took notes. The notes were not enthusiastic about the military's performance. The word promising does not appear in any of the coverage. The operation had not produced a decisive first engagement. It had produced a first engagement that raised questions. Major Meredith regrouped. He assessed. He wrote his report in the language of a man who was not going to use the word disaster, but who was selecting his words carefully around it. The emus had dispersed. The guns had malfunctioned. The terrain had not been cooperative. Tomorrow they would try again with better positioning and improved technique. Tomorrow was not significantly better than today. But Meredith was a professional. He did not give up. He adapted. He planned. He pointed the guns at more emus, and the emus continued to scatter, and the guns continued to sometimes jam, and the operation continued to produce results that no one was particularly proud of, but which everyone was committed to continuing because stopping felt worse than going on. Which is a feeling you may recognize from certain projects in your own life that you're not going to name right now. Here is something the military planners did not fully account for. Emus are extraordinarily difficult to kill. This is not folklore. This is documented military testimony. Major Meredith himself noted that the emus seemed to have an uncanny ability to absorb punishment. A burst of gunfire that would stop most animals simply did not stop an emu reliably. Their feathers are thick, their bodies are large, their nervous systems appear to operate on a slight delay between being shot and acknowledging it. One ornithologist of the era, with the weary precision of someone who had clearly been asked this question too many times, compared their constitution to that of Zulus, referring to the legendary physical endurance of Zulu warriors. They could be hit, stagger, and keep moving. You could empty a magazine into a group and watch them simply run. The machine guns, designed for human-sized targets at human-sized vulnerabilities, were not calibrated for this. Nothing was calibrated for this. The emu's physical construction is, in retrospect, almost suspiciously well suited for surviving gunfire. Its body is large, yes, but more relevantly, its vital organs are not where you might intuitively aim. The emu carries its mass low and forward. Its legs are thick and powerful and largely muscle, which is hard to incapacitate with a single shot. Its feathers, which are dense and layered and evolved for a harsh outdoor environment rather than attractiveness, provide a degree of physical cushioning that surprised everyone who had to deal with it. A bullet that would drop a deer, or stop a man, or cause any other animal to reconsider its immediate plans, hit an emu, and the emu sometimes just kept walking. This is not an exaggeration. The after-action reports describe emus being hit multiple times and continuing to move. Meredith's own account mentions birds that absorbed what should have been fatal damage and simply continued at their established pace, which in an emu's case is a kind of relentless, long-legged stride that covers ground faster than it looks like it should. They are not graceful. They are not dramatic. They are simply persistent in the way that a geological process is persistent, without urgency, without apparent awareness that things are not going according to your plan. The Lewis gun fires small caliber rounds designed for human targets at the distances and circumstances of early 20th century warfare. It was not designed with the emu in mind, because no weapons designer in 1932 or at any other time had sat down and thought, what would I build specifically to stop an emu? The answer to that question, it turned out, was something much larger, or something that removed the emu from the situation entirely, rather than requiring you to shoot it repeatedly and hope for the best. The practical effect of all this was that the kill rate per round fired was disappointing, even when the guns were working correctly. You would fire at a group of emus, the emus would take the hits and scatter, and you would look at the ground afterward and find fewer dead emus than the amount of ammunition expended seemed to warrant. The math was not working. The math would not work for the entire duration of the campaign. Someone in Canberra was eventually going to have to look at the ratio of bullets to confirmed emu casualties, and that someone was going to have a difficult afternoon. The Lewis gun was a fine weapon, reliable in many conditions, famously useful in the First World War. It was not, however, designed to be operated in 40-degree heat, covered in red dust, being pointed at emus that won't stop moving. The guns jammed. They jammed on the first day, and they jammed on subsequent days, at the worst possible moments, mid-burst, mid-pursuit, directly in the middle of what had seemed like a promising engagement. Each jam required the gun to be cleared, which took time, during which the emus continued doing whatever emus do, which was mostly dispersing or staring. Meredith and his team became intimately familiar with the maintenance of these weapons under field conditions. They cleaned them, cleared them, and pointed them at birds again, with the grim repetition of people who have started to suspect that the universe is making a specific point. The Lewis gun jams for reasons that are entirely comprehensible once you understand how it works, and entirely maddening when you're in the field with emus in range and the thing will not fire. The weapon feeds from a circular drum magazine that sits on top of the receiver. When dust enters the mechanism, and in the Campion district dust enters everything, the moving parts resist, catch, and stop. The round fails to chamber correctly. The drum fails to advance. The whole elegant mechanical sequence that turns a pull of the trigger into a fired round breaks down at one of its many links, and the gun becomes an expensive and heavy piece of equipment that does not shoot. Clearing a jam is not a complicated process if you know what you're doing, and Meredith's men knew what they were doing. Strip the drum, clear the action, check the mechanism, reload, resume. In a controlled environment, this takes seconds. In the field, in the heat, with the gun dusty and your hands sweating and the target you had carefully lined up now 30 yards further away and moving, it takes long enough to matter. Long enough that the engagement you were winning becomes an engagement you're watching conclude without you. The soldiers cleaned the guns every night. Every morning they went out and the guns jammed again, because every morning there was more dust and more heat and more emus moving across the landscape in ways that required rapid repositioning and rapid fire, and the kind of mechanical reliability that the Lewis gun, in these conditions, simply could not consistently provide. There is a version of this story in which the guns work perfectly every time and the operation goes differently. In that version, the body counts would be higher and the campaign would end faster, and there would be no Great Emu War, only a footnote about a pest control operation in Western Australia that was handled efficiently. That version did not happen. The version that happened had jamming guns and scattered emus and reports that required careful language, and it happened in front of journalists, and it became the Great Emu War, which people are still talking about in the present day. The Lewis gun's dust problem turned a pest control operation into a piece of history. It is not the first time that mechanical failure has shaped the record of events. It is possibly the most absurd time. No one planned the emu's military strategy. That is the most important thing to understand. The emus were not strategizing. They did not have a general. They did not have a map. They had millions of years of evolutionary instinct that said, when something loud and dangerous appears, scatter and do not gather in one place again until the loud, dangerous thing has gone away. This is, it turns out, an excellent counter-strategy against machine gun fire. Military analysts later noted with expressions that suggested they would have preferred to be writing about anything else, that the emus had effectively adopted the guerrilla tactic of dispersal, small mobile groups moving in different directions simultaneously, never presenting a single concentrated target. The emus had reinvented the flanking manoeuvre through sheer biological accident. The Australian Army had not. The history of warfare contains many examples of technically inferior forces defeating technically superior ones through the use of terrain, mobility, and unconventional tactics. The American Revolution, the guerrilla campaigns of the Napoleonic era, the Boer War in each case, a smaller or less equipped force frustrated a larger one through dispersion, speed, and the refusal to fight in ways that suited the larger force's strengths. Military academies teach these cases. Officers study them. Meredith had presumably been exposed to the theory. The emus were doing all of this. They were doing it without reading any of the texts and without any conscious intention whatsoever, but they were doing it. When fired upon, they dispersed into small groups. Small groups are harder to target than large groups. Small groups move faster than large groups. Small groups can penetrate terrain that is impassable to vehicles, meaning that the truck-mounted guns could not follow. The emus went where the trucks could not go, which was most places, because the Campion district is not a road. The trucks stayed on what passed for roads. The emus did not care about roads. After the first few engagements, the emus did not return to the dam or the other water sources where the soldiers had initially found them in numbers. Whether this was memory, instinct, or simple coincidence is not entirely clear, but the effect was that the strategy of finding a concentrated group near water and opening fire on them never worked as well the second time as it seemed like it should. The emus had, in a purely functional sense, learned something. Not intentionally, not strategically, but something in the ancient wiring of whatever an emu uses for a brain had processed the information that the area near the dam had produced a loud and unpleasant event and had adjusted the emu's preference for that area accordingly. The military had expected to be fighting a pest. They found themselves, in practical terms, fighting an opponent. The opponent did not know it was an opponent. The opponent thought it was migrating. But from the position of the men with the guns, the distinction was not especially comforting. The emus were behaving in ways that made them difficult to shoot, and the fact that they were not doing it on purpose did not make them easier to shoot. The results were the same. The emus were dispersed. The guns were silent. The wheat was still being eaten. The operation was not secret. Journalists were present. This was, in fact, part of the plan. The government had expected a clean, efficient victory and some good press about how Australia had solved its agricultural pest problem with soldierly efficiency. Instead, the journalists watched machine guns jam. They watched emus scatter. They watched soldiers chase birds across the scrub in the heat and come back with very little to show for it. The coverage that followed was not flattering. Australian newspapers began to write about the operation in a tone that started as sceptical and graduated toward gleeful. One Member of Parliament, Sir George Pearce, had authorised the operation in his capacity as Minister of Defence and was beginning to regret this. The press had given him a nickname. They were calling him the Minister for the Emu War. He didn't like this. The emus remained unaware of the coverage and continued their activities unchanged. The journalists had come expecting a particular story. The story they expected was one of decisive action. The Australian military, deploying modern weapons technology against an agricultural pest problem, efficiently resolving a crisis for struggling farmers. It was a good story. It had a clear arc. It had a beginning, emus invading farmland, and a middle, military deployment, and an obvious end, emus defeated, farmers grateful, government competent. The journalists had their notebooks ready. They had their angle. They arrived in the Campion district prepared to write a story about efficiency. They wrote a different story. The story they wrote had machine guns that jammed. It had emus that scattered with apparent impunity. It had soldiers tramping through scrub in remarkable heat, after birds that did not appear to be particularly troubled by the proceedings. It had a mounting disparity between the stated ambition of the operation and the observable results on the ground. Journalists, whose entire professional function is to notice the disparity between what is said and what is happening, noticed this disparity immediately. They wrote about it with the particular relish of people who have been handed a story that writes itself. The tone of the coverage shifted quickly from skepticism to something warmer, which for a newspaper is not warmth toward the subject but warmth toward the story. A military operation against birds that was failing to defeat the birds is simply a gift for a journalist. Every day produced new material. Every jammed gun, every scattered emu, every square foot of wheat that continued to be eaten despite the military's best efforts, all of it was copy, good copy, the kind of copy that gets read and shared and referenced in parliamentary debate, which is exactly what happened. Sir George Pearce was reading the newspapers. He was reading them the way you read something that you know is about you and is not going well. The nickname, the Minister for the Emu War, appeared first as a jab in an opposition speech and then migrated, as nicknames do when they are accurate, into the general vocabulary of political commentary. Pierce had authorised an operation to help farmers and get good press. He was getting press. It was not the press he had authorised the operation to get. The emus continued eating wheat, indifferent to the parliamentary and journalistic consequences of their migration because they were emus and they did not read newspapers. This was, in retrospect, an advantage. After approximately a week of diminishing returns, jamming guns, scattered emus, and increasingly uncomfortable press coverage, the military did something that required a particular kind of institutional courage. They stopped. On the 8th of November, 1932, the operation was temporarily suspended. The official explanation cited the weather. It had been dry and the emus were spread too thin across the landscape to present viable targets. The unofficial explanation, which everyone understood, was that things were not going well and someone needed time to think. Major Meredith and his team withdrew. The emus continued eating wheat. The farmers continued writing increasingly frustrated letters. The government sat with what it had done and tried to decide what to do next. After a short pause, they made the decision to try again. Same guns, same major, different results, they hoped. Now, imagine yourself standing there in the aftermath of that decision. The guns are quiet. For the first time in days, there is no metallic clatter, no shouted orders, no sudden eruption of gunfire followed by immediate disappointment. The silence feels unusual, like something important has been misplaced. The heat is still there, of course. It has not gone anywhere. It presses down on you with the same steady confidence it has shown all week. The flies, too, remain fully committed to their work. You're no longer actively at war with the emus, but the emus are still there. They have not retreated. They have not regrouped in any meaningful human sense of the word. They are simply continuing, moving through the fields in loose formations, stopping occasionally to eat, occasionally to stare, occasionally to walk directly through fencing as though it were more of a suggestion than a barrier. If anything, they seem calmer now, less hurried, as though whatever loud inconvenience had briefly interrupted their migration has politely excused itself. From a distance, it almost looks peaceful. This is, you begin to realize, part of the problem. There is nothing dramatic about the failure. No decisive moment where everything clearly goes wrong. No single catastrophic error. Just a slow accumulation of small, stubborn realities. The guns jam. The birds scatter. The train resists you. The heat drains you. The numbers refuse to add up in your favour. And eventually, without ceremony, the effort simply stops. Somewhere far away, in offices with better ventilation and significantly fewer flies, this pause is being framed as strategic. A temporary adjustment, a reconsideration of approach. Words like conditions and timing are being used with careful precision, arranged into sentences that suggest control. Out here, it feels different. Out here, it feels like you tried to shoot thousands of fast-moving, highly resilient birds across an enormous hostile landscape and discovered that this is more complicated than expected. You might find yourself looking at the Lewis gun differently now. A week ago, it was an instrument of certainty, a machine designed to impose order on chaos. You point it, you fire, and something is supposed to happen. That is the understanding. That is the agreement between human intention and mechanical response. Now it is a machine that jams, a machine that overheats, a machine that fires into a cloud of feathers and dust and motion, and produces results that are statistically underwhelming. You clean it again, you check it again, you prepare it again. But some small part of you has begun to suspect that the issue is not entirely mechanical. The issue may be. emus. Meanwhile, the farmers are watching all of this unfold with a particular kind of quiet disbelief. They had asked for help, sensible, practical help, something that would reduce the number of emus actively dismantling their livelihoods. What they received instead was a military campaign that arrived with confidence, made noise, attracted journalists, and then paused. The emus, for their part, have made no adjustments to their behaviour whatsoever. They continue eating. There is something deeply humbling about this. A modern government with structure and authority and access to military resources has engaged with a problem. Plans were made, orders were given, equipment was deployed, reports were written, and the outcome, after a week of effort, is that the emus are still here, doing exactly what they were doing before. If anything, they may be slightly more spread out, which from a tactical perspective is not ideal. As the days pass during this temporary retreat, a subtle shift begins to occur, not in the landscape, which remains entirely indifferent, but in perception. The emus are no longer just targets. They are participants, not intentional ones, not strategic ones, but participants nonetheless in a situation that has become increasingly difficult to categorize. They are not winning exactly, but they are certainly not losing. And so the pause continues, the dust settles, quite literally, the reports are reviewed, the pressure builds from farmers, from the press, from within the government itself. Something must be done, something more effective, something that produces results that can be described, ideally without hesitation, and eventually a decision is made. They will try again. Same landscape, same birds, same fundamental problem. But this time, surely it will go differently. You look out across the fields at the slow, steady movement of emus under the vast Australian sky, and you might find yourself wondering, not for the first time, what exactly, differently, is supposed to mean. The second phase of the Great Emu War began in mid-November, and it went somewhat better, in the way that scoring 3 points after scoring 0 points is technically an improvement. Meredith had adapted his approach, rather than attempting to drive the emus into killing grounds which assumed the emus would cooperate, an assumption that had not survived contact with actual emus. He mounted one of the Lewis guns on a truck. The idea was mobility. Chase the emus, keep up with them, maintain fire. This worked, in theory. In practice, the Western Australian outback roads in 1932 were not what you would call smooth, and a Lewis gun mounted on a bouncing truck, pointed at birds running at speed across broken ground, produced results that were enthusiastic but imprecise. The truck would hit a rut, the gun would swing wide, the emus would continue running, the soldiers would keep going. Now picture yourself in that truck. You're holding on with one hand, the other gripping a machine gun that was not designed for this particular experience. The vehicle beneath you is doing its best, which is to say, it is rattling across the landscape with the determination of something that has already accepted its limitations. The ground is uneven in a way that feels deliberate, as though the terrain itself has taken a position on this entire operation. Ahead of you, the emus are running. They are not running in a straight line, because of course they're not. They move in loose, shifting directions, occasionally clustering, occasionally dispersing, always maintaining just enough unpredictability to make the concept of aiming feel more philosophical than practical. You try to track one through the sights, but the truck hits a bump, and suddenly you're aiming at a completely different patch of horizon. You fire anyway. The sound is immediate and loud and briefly satisfying in the way that loud mechanical responses often are. There's a sense, for a moment, that something decisive is happening. But then the dust settles, and the emus are still running. Perhaps fewer in one direction, more in another. It is difficult to tell. They do not pause to provide feedback. The truck accelerates. This is the new strategy: speed, pursuit, persistence. If the emus will not gather, then you will follow. If they scatter, then you will scatter with them, in a more organised, heavily armed fashion. It is in its own way a logical adjustment. It is also exhausting. The heat has not improved. The dust has, if anything, become more personal. It coats everything: your clothes, your equipment, the mechanisms of the gun itself. You can feel it in your mouth, in your eyes, in the small spaces between moving parts where it was never meant to be. The gun works until it doesn't. The truck moves until it doesn't. The emus, however, continue with remarkable consistency. There is a moment, somewhere in the middle of this pursuit, where the entire situation becomes quietly surreal. You're in a military vehicle, operating a mounted machine gun, chasing large flightless birds across an open landscape, attempting to apply coordinated fire to targets that are, at all times, slightly out of reach. The plan exists. The execution exists. The outcome, however, remains elusive. The emus do not panic in the way you might expect. They do not bunch together in a way that would be helpful. Instead, they seem to operate on a simple, effective principle. Keep moving, but not all in the same direction. Some veer left, others continue forward. A few disappear into scrub that the truck cannot follow. The result is not chaos exactly. It is a kind of natural distribution that resists concentration. You begin to understand something important. This is not a single target. This is thousands of small, independent decisions happening simultaneously, each one contributing to a larger pattern that is very difficult to engage with using a machine gun mounted on a moving vehicle. The more you chase, the more they spread. The more they spread, the less effective the chase becomes. And yet there are moments of progress, occasional successes, a group caught in slightly more open ground, a burst of fire that lands more accurately than the last. Numbers are reported, results are noted. On paper it does look better. Not dramatically better, but better enough to justify continuing. Back in the distance, the farmland remains. The wheat fields are still there, though increasingly less intact. The fences are still being tested by determined birds with no particular respect for boundaries. The farmers are still watching, measuring success not in reports or percentages, but in how much of their crop remains at the end of the day. From where you are, bouncing across the outback in pursuit of a moving, dispersing problem, it is difficult to say whether this new approach will resolve anything. It feels more active, more dynamic. There is movement now, a sense of engagement that was missing from the earlier attempts. But there is also a growing awareness that activity and effectiveness are not always the same thing. The truck hits another rut. The gun shifts again. The emus continue running. And you continue following, holding on, adjusting your aim, and participating in what is increasingly a very mobile version of the same underlying challenge. This time, it is different, just not perhaps in the way anyone had hoped. Picture yourself in the back of a military truck, holding on to a mounted machine gun, bouncing across cracked earth in 40-degree heat, chasing emus. The emus are faster than the truck on anything that isn't a straight road. The roads are rarely straight. When they do go straight, the emus simply run off the road. You swing the gun. The truck hits something, you hold on. The emus veer left. The truck cannot veer left because there is a ditch. You watch the emus disappear into scrub that the truck cannot follow them into. You are covered in dust. The gun is covered in dust. The emus are fine. This was not in the briefing. You had a briefing. The briefing did not include this specific scenario. Somewhere back in Canberra, someone is reading a newspaper and having a difficult morning. Now stay there for a moment. Do not get out of the truck. There's nowhere useful to go, and the truck, for all its limitations, is still your best option. Instead, settle into the rhythm of it, the constant motion. the repeated cycle of hope, adjustment, and mild disappointment. The engine hums beneath you with a kind of stubborn optimism. It believes, in its own mechanical way, that forward motion is progress. And to be fair, it is not entirely wrong. You are objectively moving forward. The problem is that the emus are also moving forward, often slightly faster, and usually in directions that do not align with your current trajectory. You begin to understand the importance of terrain, not in an abstract map-based sense, but in a deeply personal physical way. Every bump is no longer just a feature of the landscape. It is direct intervention in your ability to aim. Every rut becomes a negotiation between control and momentum. Every patch of uneven ground is a reminder that the truck, impressive as it may have seemed when stationary, is now engaged in a relationship with the environment that is not entirely cooperative. The emus, by contrast, appear to have reached an agreement with the terrain some time ago. They move across it with a kind of effortless confidence, over dips, through scrub, around obstacles that the truck must either confront directly or avoid entirely. They do not need roads, they do not need clear paths, they simply move, adjusting as necessary, never committing to a single line of travel for long enough to be predictable. You attempt to compensate. You anticipate where they might go. You track not the individual bird, but the general direction of the group. You try to lead your aim, accounting for both your own movement and theirs. For a brief moment, everything aligns. The truck steadies. The target is clear. The gun responds. And then the truck hits another rut. The moment passes. There is a peculiar kind of patience that develops here. Not the calm, restful patience of someone waiting for something pleasant, but the steady, resigned patience of someone who has accepted that results will arrive slowly, if at all. You fire when you can. You adjust when you must. You continue, because stopping does not solve the problem either. Somewhere along the way, the idea of a clean, decisive engagement begins to feel unrealistic. This is not a battlefield in the traditional sense. There are no lines, no formations, no clear beginning or end to an encounter. There is only movement, constant low-level interaction between a mobile machine and a population of birds that refuses to behave in a way that would make this easier. You might start to notice small details, the way the emus occasionally pause, just briefly, before changing direction again. The way some seem to act as informal leaders, not by intention, but by position. The way a group can dissolve into smaller groups and then reassemble elsewhere without any visible coordination. It is not strategy, but it is effective. Behind you, a trail of dust marks your path across the landscape. It lingers in the air, slowly settling, a visible record of effort. If someone were to look at it from a distance, they might see movement, activity, engagement. It would look like something is happening, and something is happening, just not necessarily the thing that was intended. The truck slows, then accelerates again. Another group of emus has come into view. You adjust your grip, reposition your stance, prepare for another attempt. The cycle continues. There is no clear moment of victory here, only a series of attempts, each one slightly different from the last, each one shaped by terrain, timing, and the quiet, persistent independence of the emus themselves, and somewhere, far away, reports are being written, numbers are being recorded, words like progress are being considered, carefully selected, arranged into sentences that suggest improvement. On paper, it may even look convincing. Out here in the back of the truck, it feels more like this: you are moving, the emus are moving, and between those two facts lies the entire complication. While the military campaign unfolded around them, the emus were simply doing what emus do during migration. They had come to the Campion district because there was water and food there, specifically the farmers' dams and wheat crops. which from an emu's perspective were an extraordinary stroke of luck. Emus migrate in large groups following ancient routes, determined by rainfall and food availability. They do not have property rights. They do not have border awareness. They do not understand fences, which is why they walked through them. They do not understand that the wheat belongs to someone, which is why they ate it. They were following an impulse as old as the continent itself, and they were doing it with the single-minded, unhurried confidence of a creature that has no natural predators large enough to matter. The machine guns were, at this point, the largest thing that had ever tried to stop an emu migration, and the emus were managing. Now shift your perspective slightly. Step away from the truck, from the guns, from the reports and the plans, and imagine the same landscape from a different point of view, lower to the ground, quieter, not concerned with strategy or outcomes, but with something much simpler: food, water, movement. You're an emu, not metaphorically, not symbolically, just physically present in this landscape, under the same wide sky, moving through the same dry air. You do not know what a government is. You have no concept of farmland as a legal construct. The wheat in front of you is not a crop. It is simply food that is available in large quantities. This is, from your perspective, an excellent development. The journey that brought you here did not begin with a plan. It began with rain, or the absence of it, with the subtle shifts in the environment that signal where resources might be found. Over time, across generations, these movements have formed patterns, routes that are not written down, not taught in any formal sense, but followed nonetheless. You move because there is something ahead. You stop because there is something here. And the Campion district in 1932 offers both. The wheat is dense, accessible, and importantly stationary. It does not run away. It does not hide. It simply grows, waiting to be consumed by anything that arrives with the appropriate appetite. The dams provide water. The fences, while present, are not particularly persuasive. You encounter them, consider them briefly, and then continue through or around them, depending on what seems easiest. There is no malice in this, no intent to disrupt or destroy. The destruction, from a human perspective, is real and significant. But from here, within this simpler framework, it is just the natural consequence of movement intersecting with opportunity. Occasionally there is noise, loud, sudden, unfamiliar noise. It arrives without warning, cutting through the steady rhythm of walking and feeding. When it happens, you respond in the only way that makes sense. You move away from it, quickly if necessary, in a different direction than the others, if that seems more effective. You do not gather to investigate. You do not form a defensive line. You do not attempt to understand the source. You simply move, and when the noise stops, or becomes distant enough to be irrelevant, you resume what you were doing before: eating, walking, existing within the landscape in the same way you always have. This is, without intention, a remarkably effective response. From above it might look like coordination, like a strategy designed to avoid concentrated threats. But from within, it is just a series of individual decisions, each one simple, each one immediate, each one based on a basic principle: move away from what is unpleasant, move toward what is useful. The result is a pattern that is difficult to predict. Groups form and dissolve, directions shift. The landscape is navigated not as a grid, but as a continuous space of possibilities. There is no central point, no single place where all movement converges, and because of that, there is no single place where all movement can be stopped. Back in the human world, this is becoming increasingly apparent. The military approach assumes a kind of cooperation, not deliberate cooperation, but predictable behavior. The idea that the EMUs will gather or remain within a defined area, or respond consistently to pressure. But the emus are not operating within that framework. They are not operating within any framework that can be easily mapped. They are instead following something older, something quieter, a pattern shaped by environment rather than intention, by survival rather than strategy. And so the two systems meet. On one side, a structured effort to control and reduce a population through coordinated action. On the other, a loose distributed movement that does not recognize the terms of that effort. The result is not a clear conflict, it is more like misalignment. The machine guns are real, the trucks are real, the reports, the decisions, the frustration, all real. But they are being applied to something that does not fully register them as meaningful. The emus continue. They move through the fields, through the fences, across the dry ground, under the same vast sky that has always been there. The migration does not stop. It adjusts briefly when necessary, and then resumes. And from their perspective, nothing particularly unusual is happening. Just another stretch of land, just another source of food, just another step forward. Numbers in the Great Emu War are contested, and the contestation itself tells you something. The military reported that by the end of the operation, approximately 900 emus had been killed, with a further 2,500 wounded. The word wounded being used here with the understanding that a wounded emu is an emu that received gunfire and then continued walking. Some estimates put the total kills lower. The farmers pointed out that the emu population in their fields had not noticeably declined. The emus had not read the casualty reports. An ornithologist doing rough math on the ammunition expended versus the confirmed kills calculated that it had taken approximately 10 bullets per emu. The Lewis gun holds 97 rounds per drum magazine. You may do the arithmetic yourself and arrive at the same conclusion everyone else arrived at, which is that this was not a cost-effective campaign. Now take a moment to sit with those numbers, not in a dramatic way, just gently, the way you might consider something mildly confusing, before deciding not to think about it too hard. Because the numbers, while precise on paper, have a slightly uncertain quality when placed next to reality. 900 emus. It sounds like a large number. It is a large number in most contexts. If you were to see 900 of anything gathered in one place, you would likely feel that something significant was happening. And yet here, in the wide and open landscape of Western Australia, the number begins to feel smaller. Because the starting point was not 900, it was tens of thousands. The emus were not arranged neatly for counting. They were not standing in lines waiting to be tallied. They were moving constantly across a space that does not lend itself to easy measurement. So when a report says approximately 900, what it really means is something closer to, this is our best estimate based on what we saw, what we think we hit, and what we can reasonably claim without inviting further questions. The word approximately is doing a lot of work here. Then there is the matter of the wounded. 2,500 emus described as wounded, which suggests at first glance a secondary category of success, progress, even if incomplete. But then you consider the nature of an emu, and the definition begins to shift slightly. A wounded emu in this context is often an emu that has been shot, and then kept moving. Perhaps slightly less efficiently, perhaps with a brief pause, but moving nonetheless, continuing the migration, continuing to eat, continuing to exist within the same system that existed before the bullets arrived. This complicates things, because in most military contexts a wounded target is still a removed or reduced threat. Here, the distinction is less clear. A wounded emu is not necessarily an absent emu. It is quite often still very much present, still in the field, still eating wheat. The farmers, watching from a much closer perspective, begin to notice this. They are less concerned with official numbers and more concerned with what is directly in front of them. The fields look much the same. The emus are still there, moving through the crops with the same steady confidence. If there has been a reduction, it is not immediately obvious, and so a quiet disagreement begins to form. Not a loud, confrontational dispute, but a subtle divergence between reported outcomes and observed reality. The reports suggest progress. The fields suggest continuity. Both are technically true in their own way, but they do not align as neatly as one might hope. Somewhere, someone begins doing the math. Ammunition used. Emus confirmed. Ratios calculated. It is not complicated math, but it produces a result that is difficult to present enthusiastically. Approximately 10 bullets per emu on average, which, when considered alongside the cost of ammunition, the deployment of soldiers, and the general effort involved, leads to a conclusion that is best described as inefficient. No one writes that word in the official summary. Instead, there are phrases, careful phrases, challenging, conditions, dispersed targets, limited engagement opportunities, each one accurate, each one slightly softer than the underlying reality. Out in the landscape, none of this language is necessary. The emus continue moving, the fields continue being eaten, and the gap between expectation and outcome becomes quietly, steadily more noticeable. You might imagine someone late in the evening looking over the numbers again, turning them over, adjusting them slightly, considering how best to present them. Not to deceive exactly, but to frame them in a way that feels reasonable. Because the alternative is to state plainly that a military operation involving machine guns has resulted in a modest reduction of a very large number of birds, many of which appear to have continued their activities regardless. Which is true, but not particularly satisfying, and so the numbers remain. 900, 2,500, 10 bullets per emu. They sit there on the page, neat and orderly, suggesting a clarity that the situation itself does not entirely possess. Meanwhile, just beyond the edge of those reports, the emus continue their quiet, steady work, entirely unconcerned with how they are being counted. Back in Canberra, the House of Representatives was having what can only be described as a moment. Questions were asked. The Minister for Defence, Sir George Pearce, was required to stand up and explain, in the Chamber of Australian Democracy, why the military had been deployed against birds and what precisely had been accomplished. The opposition was not gentle. One member suggested the government had managed to be defeated by wildlife. Another raised the possibility that the emus had, in a meaningful strategic sense, won. Pearce, who had approved the operation with genuine confidence back in October, now wore the expression of a man who has looked at the newspaper every morning for 2 weeks and found it worse each time. The debate was recorded in Hansard. It is still readable today. It is not a comfortable document. Now imagine yourself inside that chamber, not in the outback, not in the dust and heat and motion of trucks and emus, but here, indoors, structured, formal, with polished wood and measured voices. The air is different, cooler, controlled and filled not with flies but with words. Words are the tools here. They are arranged carefully, delivered with intention, and designed to achieve something that machine guns, it turns out, could not. A sense of order. A narrative that makes events feel contained, understandable, perhaps even reasonable. Sir George Pearce stands. This is not an unfamiliar act for him. He has stood in this chamber before, spoken on matters of defence, policy, national importance. There is a rhythm to it, a familiarity, but this time the subject is slightly unusual. You can feel it in the room. There is a subtle shift in tone, a quiet awareness that the topic at hand does not sit comfortably within the usual framework of military discussion. The Australian Army has been deployed. That part's clear. The purpose of that deployment, however, requires a certain amount of careful phrasing. because the purpose involves emus. Questions begin, not aggressive at first, but pointed, precise, a request for clarification. What exactly was the objective? How many resources were committed? What were the results? Each question is reasonable on its own. Together they begin to form a picture that is difficult to navigate cleanly. Pierce responds. He speaks in the language of administration, of effort, of conditions, of outcomes framed in terms that sound measured and controlled. He refers to the reports, the numbers, the actions taken. There is no mention of frustration, of bouncing trucks, of birds that refuse to behave in ways that align with military expectations. There is instead a focus on what can be said with confidence. But the room is not entirely convinced. Across the chamber, members of the opposition listen, and then they respond. Not with anger exactly, but with a kind of restrained disbelief. One of them suggests, carefully but clearly, that the situation appears to involve a military force encountering resistance from wildlife. Another, perhaps less restrained, frames it more directly, that the emus, in a practical sense, have not been defeated. There is a pause after that, not a long one, but enough to let the idea settle. It is not a statement that fits easily into the usual categories of parliamentary discussion. Victories and defeats are typically reserved for conflicts between nations, between organised groups with defined objectives. Here, the comparison feels slightly off, and yet it persists. Because when you strip away the structure, the language, the reports and summaries, what remains is a simple question. Has the problem been resolved? And the answer, at least at this point, appears to be no. Pierce continues. He maintains composure, which is, in itself, an achievement. He explains the challenges, the conditions in the field, the nature of the targets, all of it true, all of it relevant. But there is an undercurrent now. He sensed that the explanation is being weighed against something that is not entirely visible within the chamber. Outside, beyond the walls, beyond the reach of parliamentary language, the emus are still there, still moving, still eating. The debate continues, recorded line by line in Hansard, a permanent record of a moment where the machinery of government encountered something that did not respond as expected. The words are preserved, formal and precise, capturing the exchange in a way that feels both accurate and slightly surreal. Because history, when written down, often smooths out the edges. It presents events in a sequence, with clarity and structure. But in the moment, sitting there in that chamber, listening to the discussion unfold, you might feel a quiet sense that something unusual has happened. Not catastrophic, not dramatic, just unusual. A situation where the full weight of a government decision has been brought to bear on a problem, and the problem has remained politely but firmly unresolved. Eventually the questions move on. They always do. Other matters arise. Other topics take their place. But this one lingers in a subtle way, in the tone of the room, in the expressions of those present, in the knowledge that somewhere, far from this carefully ordered space, a group of large flightless birds continues to exist entirely outside the logic of the discussion. And that, perhaps, is the most uncomfortable part of all. Through all of this, the military operations, the parliamentary debate, the press coverage, the second and third attempts, the farmers were still there, still watching their crops, still waking up every morning to find emus in their fields. The wheat farmers of the Campion district had not asked for a public spectacle. They had asked for pest control. They were veterans, many of them, who had been promised land and a future by a government that seemed, with each passing month, to have made that promise in a lighter and lighter shade of ink. The emus ate the wheat. The rabbits ate what was left. The prices for whatever remained were too low to justify. The depression had taken the markets, the drought had taken the rain, and now the emus had taken what little was left, and the army had come, and the army had left, and the emus were still there. The farmers kept farming. They did not have another option. Now imagine yourself waking up here, not as a soldier, not as a minister, not as a journalist observing from a distance, but as someone whose entire year depends on what is standing in that field. The morning arrives early, not because you're well rested, but because the heat will soon make work more difficult, and there is always work to be done. You step outside. The air is already warm, carrying that dry, familiar weight. The land stretches out in front of you, flat and open, the horizon wide in a way that leaves very little room for illusion. You look toward your crops, and for a brief moment, before your eyes fully adjust, you might allow yourself a small hope. Maybe today will be different. Then you see them. Not all at once, not in a dramatic reveal, but gradually. A shape here, movement there, a line of figures where there should be none. Emus scattered across the field, moving slowly, steadily, with the same calm confidence they had yesterday, and the day before that. They are not in a hurry. This is what makes it harder. If they were frantic, destructive in an obvious chaotic way, it might feel like something you could respond to, but they are not. They move through the wheat as though it belongs there, as though they belong there, taking what they need without urgency, without hesitation. You walk closer, not quickly. There is no point in rushing. As you approach, some of them look up briefly. There is a moment of acknowledgement, not recognition exactly, but awareness. Then they move away, not far, just enough to maintain a comfortable distance. They will be back. They always come back. You have tried what you can. You have built fences. They walk through them. You have reinforced the fences. They find the weak points. You have driven them away again and again, only to watch them return, guided by something older than your efforts, something that does not consider your needs as part of its calculations. And so you write letters. Carefully at first, respectfully. You explain the situation, the losses, the scale of the problem. You ask for help, not as a favour, but as something that was, in a way, promised. You were told this land would be an opportunity, a future. You came here, you worked it, you endured the conditions, and now this. The response comes, slowly, but it comes. The army arrives, there's movement, activity, a sense that something is being done. For a moment, there is relief, a belief that this problem finally will be addressed with the seriousness it requires. You watch the soldiers, you watch the trucks, the guns, the effort. You hear the reports, you read the newspapers, you follow the progress as best you can, trying to understand what it means for you, for your land, for the next harvest. And then, gradually it becomes clear. The emus are still there. The army leaves. The reports continue. The discussions continue. But here, in the field, the outcome is simple. The wheat is still being eaten. The fences are still being tested. The problem has not been removed. It has, at best, been engaged with. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from this. Not the physical exhaustion of labour, though that is always present, but a quieter kind. The kind that settles in when effort does not produce the expected result. When solutions arrive, make noise, and then leave, while the underlying issue remains, and yet you continue. Because there is no alternative. You repair what you can, you salvage what remains, you prepare for the next day, knowing with a kind of steady certainty that it will begin much like this one did. The land will still be here, the heat will return, and the emus, moving through the fields with that same unhurried confidence, will still be part of the landscape. You keep farming, not because it is working perfectly, but because it is the only thing left to do. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the edges of your field, the larger story continues. the debates, the reports, the quiet conclusions being formed. But here, in this moment, the story is much simpler. There is the land, there is the work, and there are the emus. Major Meredith, to his considerable credit, did not pretend the operation had gone well. His official reports were military documents, precise and restrained, but between the lines of careful language you can find something that reads unmistakably like a man who has been genuinely surprised by birds. He noted the emus' ability to absorb fire. He noted their dispersal behaviour. He noted the terrain difficulties, and in later years, interviewed and quoted on the subject he clearly could not escape. He said something that became one of the more quoted lines to emerge from the entire episode. He described the emus as having the resilience of Zulus and noted that they could face a machine gun with the invulnerability of tanks. He said it without obvious irony. He had earned the right to say it without irony. He had been there. Now imagine reading that report. Not quickly, not as a summary, but slowly. The way these documents are meant to be read. The language is formal, controlled, shaped by habit and expectation. This is how military outcomes are described, with clarity, with structure, with a careful avoidance of anything that might feel uncertain. And yet, as you move through it, something unusual begins to emerge. Not in what is said directly, but in what is implied. The tone is steady, but the content carries a kind of quiet disbelief. Not exaggerated, not emotional, but present nonetheless. A recognition that the situation encountered in the field did not align neatly with the assumptions that preceded it. The emus, it turns out, did not behave as expected. This is written in the language of observation. Their movement patterns are noted. Their tendency to scatter, to avoid concentration, to move in ways that reduce the effectiveness of sustained fire. Each point is made calmly, almost clinically, but taken together, they form a picture that is difficult to interpret as anything other than challenging. You might pause on that word. Challenging is doing a great deal of work here, because what it represents is not a minor inconvenience, not a small deviation from plan, but a fundamental mismatch between method and subject. The tools were real, the effort was real, the intent was clear, but the result did not follow in a straight line from those inputs. And Meredith, to his credit, does not attempt to force that line. He does not claim success where there is none. He does not reshape the outcome into something more comfortable. Instead, he describes what happened as accurately as he can within the constraints of the format. There is something quietly admirable about that. A kind of professional honesty that does not rely on dramatic statements or overt admissions. It is simply there, in the details, in the acknowledgement of what was observed, rather than what was hoped for. Later, when he speaks more freely, the language shifts slightly. The comparison he makes to resilience, to endurance, to the ability to withstand force is not offered lightly. It comes from experience, from having stood in that landscape, having seen the response firsthand, having participated in an effort that did not produce the expected outcome. When he says that the emus could face machine gun fire with a kind of invulnerability, he is not being poetic, he is being precise. Not in the literal sense, of course. The emus were not invulnerable. They were affected. Some were killed, some were wounded. But the overall system, the movement, the population as a whole, continued in a way that made the application of force feel insufficient. And that is the distinction. It is not that nothing happened. It is that what happened was not enough. You might imagine Meredith reflecting on this later. Not in a formal setting, not in a report, but in a quieter moment. Thinking back on the operation, on the expectations that accompanied it, on the reality that unfolded instead. There is no indication that he took it personally, no sign of frustration directed outward. If anything, there is a sense of adjustment, an understanding that what was encountered required a different way of thinking, that not every problem responds to the same approach, that sometimes the environment, the subject, and the method simply do not align. Back in the field, during those days of movement and dust and repeated attempts, that realization would not have arrived all at once. It would have built gradually, with each engagement that produced less than expected, with each group of emus that scattered at precisely the wrong moment, with each report that required careful wording to accurately reflect what had occurred, and eventually it would have settled into something like acceptance, not defeat, not exactly, but a recognition that this was not a situation that could be resolved quickly, cleanly, or completely with the tools at hand. There is a quiet dignity in that, in seeing something for what it is, even when it does not match what it was supposed to be. And in the end, that may be the most accurate assessment of all. Not that the operation failed in a dramatic, decisive way, but that it encountered something it was not designed to solve, and responded as best it could with honesty. The Australian government, not fully satisfied with the results of the first two phases, authorised further operations in 1932 and again in 1948. The later campaigns went somewhat better, largely because the scope was adjusted, the tactics were more modest, and no one invited the press. But the fact that there were subsequent campaigns is itself the footnote, the admission that the original operation had not solved the problem, that the emus had not been persuaded to leave, and that the farmer situation had not materially improved. Each subsequent campaign was quieter, more efficient, and significantly less documented, because everyone involved had learned what happens when you document an emu campaign. You end up in Hansard, you end up in newspapers, you end up with a nickname you will carry for the rest of your political career. Now imagine the shift. Not in the landscape. That remains exactly as it was. The same dry fields, the same heat, the same wide, indifferent sky. The emus are still there, moving along their routes with the same quiet consistency. What changes is not the environment, but the approach. The next time this problem is addressed, it is done. More quietly, there are no journalists standing nearby taking notes, no expectation of a clean public victory, no sense that this will be something worth announcing. Instead, it becomes something closer to a task, a problem to be managed rather than solved in a single, decisive moment. The scale is reduced. The ambition is lowered, though no one uses that word. Instead, it is framed as refinement, a more targeted effort, a better understanding of conditions. But underneath those phrases is a simple realization. This is not a situation that responds well to grand gestures, so the gestures become smaller, more careful, less visible. You might picture a handful of men rather than a formal deployment. Actions taken when opportunities present themselves rather than attempts to force those opportunities into existence. The emphasis shifts from control to influence. A subtle difference, but an important one. And, perhaps most significantly, there is less talking about it. Because talking about it, it turns out, has consequences. The earlier campaign did not just produce results, it produced attention, questions, headlines, interpretations that were difficult to manage once they had taken shape. The story, once released, had a life of its own. It travelled beyond the fields, beyond the reports, into places where it was examined not just for its outcomes, but for what it represented. And what it represented was complicated. So the next time, the story is kept smaller. Not hidden, exactly, but not emphasized. It exists, it happens, but it does not announce itself. There are no expectations of spectacle, and therefore no disappointment when spectacle does not occur. In this quieter version, things do in fact improve. Not dramatically, not in a way that transforms the situation entirely, but enough to be noticeable, enough to suggest that a different approach, a more measured one, is better suited to the nature of the problem. The emus are still there. They are always still there. But the interaction between human effort and emu behaviour becomes less confrontational, less about overwhelming force, more about gradual adjustment, the kind of change that does not produce headlines, but does over time produce results. And perhaps that is the lesson, not the obvious one, not the version that fits neatly into a single sentence, but the quieter understanding that emerges after the initial attempt has passed. That some problems are not resolved by intensity, that some situations require patience, adaptation, and a willingness to let go of the idea of a decisive victory. Back in 1932, that lesson had not yet fully formed. It was still being learned in real time, through experience that did not match expectation. By 1948, it had begun to settle into practice, into a way of approaching the problem that acknowledged its complexity without trying to simplify it into something it was not. You might imagine someone years later looking back on the original campaign, not with embarrassment exactly, but with a kind of quiet recognition that it was in its own way necessary, that it revealed something important, even if that something was not immediately useful in the way it had been intended. Because without that first attempt, the one with the machine guns, the trucks, the reports, the attention, there would be no reason to adjust, no reason to reconsider the approach, no reason to arrive at the quieter, more effective methods that followed. And so the later campaigns happen, less visible, less discussed, more aligned with the reality of the landscape and the behaviour of the emus. They do not end the problem entirely, but they do something else, something perhaps more valuable. They fit the problem more accurately. And in doing so, they avoid becoming a story that needs to be explained. The Great Emu War did not stay in Australia. Word travelled, as embarrassing stories tend to do, and the international reaction was a mixture of disbelief and delight. British newspapers covered it. American papers found it irresistible. The image of a modern military force, equipped with machine guns, organised under a career officer, backed by government authority, being effectively stymied by large flightless birds, struck people everywhere as both extremely funny and quietly instructive. There were editorial cartoons, there were jokes, there were serious questions posed in a tone that was not entirely serious about what this said about the limits of military power against opponents who simply did not understand that they were supposed to lose. The emus continued to be unaware of their international fame. They were in a field somewhere. They were eating something. Now imagine the story leaving the landscape. It lifts gently from the heat and dust of Western Australia and travels outward, carried not by wind but by print, ink on paper, headlines crossing oceans, arriving in cities where the ground is not red and cracked, where the air is cooler, where the idea of chasing emus with machine guns feels distant. And yet, suddenly, it is not distant at all. It is right there, on the front page. You're sitting in London, perhaps, or New York. You unfold a newspaper with a casual expectation of reading about markets, politics, distant events framed in familiar terms, and instead you're presented with something that does not quite fit, a military operation, against birds. There is a pause, not a dramatic pause, just a small moment where your mind adjusts. You read the headline again, just to be sure. The details follow. Soldiers deployed, machine guns used, emus not cooperating. It is, in a word, memorable. Not because it is the most important story, but because it is the kind of story that lingers, that moves from one person to another, not as a formal report, but as something closer to a conversation. Have you seen this? Apparently they sent the army. And the birds, there is a tone that develops around it. Not cruel, not entirely dismissive, but lightly amused. The kind of amusement reserved for situations that are real, but feel slightly unreal in the telling. Editorial cartoons begin to appear. Artists working quickly sketch out scenes of soldiers facing lines of emus, the balance of power subtly inverted for effect. The details are exaggerated, of course. They always are. But they do not need much exaggeration to begin with. The core of the story is already unusual enough, and then come the interpretations. Not official ones, not structured analyses, but the kind that emerge naturally when people encounter something that does not behave the way they expect. There are quiet observations, often phrased as jokes, about what this says, about modern systems, about expectations, about the assumption that organisation and equipment will always produce the desired outcome. These observations are not always serious, but they are not entirely unserious either, because beneath the humour there is a small persistent idea that not everything responds to force in predictable ways, that sometimes the thing being acted upon does not recognise the framework in which the action is taking place. The emus, after all, are not resisting. They are not opposing anything in the way that humans understand opposition. They are simply continuing, moving, eating, existing in a pattern that does not include the concept of surrender. And that, from a distance, becomes part of the story. A detail that is repeated, slightly adjusted each time until it becomes almost symbolic. Not just a group of birds, but an example of something larger. Something about limits, about assumptions, about the quiet ways in which reality can diverge from expectation. Meanwhile, back in Australia, the situation remains exactly what it was. The fields are still there, the farmers are still working, the emus are still moving through the landscape, unaware that they have become a topic of international discussion. They do not know that they are being referenced in conversations thousands of miles away. They do not know that they have, in a sense, entered the category of stories people tell. They are, as always, focused on simpler things: food, water, movement, and this contrast between the story as it travels and the reality as it continues becomes part of the quiet absurdity of it all. Because the further the story moves from its source, the more it becomes about meaning, about interpretation, about what it represents, while at its origin it remains something much more direct, a problem, an attempt to solve it, and a result that did not quite align with the plan. The world, observing from a comfortable distance, finds something in that to reflect on, to laugh about, to remember. And the emus, standing somewhere under the same wide sky, continue eating, entirely unconcerned with what anyone, anywhere, happens to think. The emu problem did not end with the military campaigns, and its eventual management was far less cinematic than the operations that preceded it. The most effective long-term solution was also the most boring: better fencing. The farmers lobbied for government support to build and maintain emu-proof fencing around their properties, and eventually, over years and incremental funding battles, this was partially achieved. It was not glamorous. It did not make the papers. But it worked in a way that machine guns had not, because fencing does not require the emus to cooperate. Fencing does not need the emus to stand still, or scatter in the right direction, or fail to absorb gunfire. Fencing simply exists, and the emus, encountering it, generally go somewhere else. This is the lesson that cost the Australian government several thousand rounds of Lewis gun ammunition and at least 2 very bad weeks of parliamentary questions. Now imagine standing beside that fence. Not the idea of a fence, not a line on a map or a proposal in a report, but the actual structure. Posts driven into the ground at regular intervals, wire stretched tightly between them, It is not impressive in the way a machine gun is impressive. It does not make noise. It does not move. It does not suggest power in the dramatic sense. It simply stands there. And that, as it turns out, is enough. You walk along its length slowly, the sun already warming the metal, the ground dry beneath your feet. There is no urgency here. No need to chase anything. No need to anticipate movement or react to sudden changes. The fence does not require timing. It does not require aim. It requires only that it remains where it is. On one side, the field. On the other, the open land. And between them, this quiet boundary that does not negotiate. The emus approach it eventually. They always do. Not all at once, not in a coordinated wave, but in the same scattered, loosely connected way they move through everything else. A few arrive first, walking with that familiar steady pace. They do not rush. There is no reason to rush. They reach the fence. And then, for a moment, something different happens. They stop. Not for long, just long enough to register that this is not like the other things they have encountered. It does not move when they move toward it. It does not shift or open or respond. It is simply there, consistently without variation. One of them steps closer, tests it, in the limited way an emu tests anything. A push, a slight adjustment of direction. The fence does not yield. It does not present a gap large enough to walk through, not easily. So the emu does something very simple. It turns, not dramatically, not in frustration, just a quiet redirection. There is no need to overcome the obstacle if going around it is easier. And somewhere along the line of the fence there may be a weakness, a gap, a place where the structure is less complete. But until that point is found, the path of least resistance is simply elsewhere. And so the emu moves on. This is the entire interaction. No noise, no report, no headline, just a quiet adjustment of direction. You might stand there and notice how different this feels. There is no sense of conflict here, no moment of engagement, nothing that would be described in any formal sense as a battle. And yet, in practical terms, something has been achieved that the earlier effort struggled to accomplish. The emu is no longer in the field, not because it was forced out, but because it did not enter in the first place. This is, in its own way, a more complete solution. Not perfect, of course. Fences require maintenance. They break, they wear down, they develop weak points over time. The landscape itself resists permanence, but as a general approach, as a way of shaping the interaction between farmland and migration, it proves reliable. And reliability, while not exciting, has its own value. Back in the earlier days, the focus had been on action, on doing something visible, something decisive. The arrival of soldiers, the sound of gunfire, the movement of trucks across the landscape, all of it suggested progress, even when the results were uncertain. The fence suggests something else. It suggests patience. It suggests that not every problem needs to be confronted directly. That sometimes the most effective solution is not to engage with the problem at all, but to create conditions in which the problem simply goes somewhere else. It is not dramatic. It does not lend itself to storytelling. No one writes headlines about well-maintained fencing, but over time, quietly, without drawing attention to itself, it changes the outcome. And if you step back and look at it, you might notice something almost comforting in that. After all the noise, all the effort, all the attempts to force a solution into existence, the answer turns out to be something simple, something steady, something that does not depend on timing or precision or expectation, just a line in the ground, holding its place, and gently, consistently, guiding everything else around it. The emu has been in Australia for something between 80 and 90 million years, depending on which fossil evidence you find most persuasive. It watched the continent drift. It outlasted the megafauna, the giant wombats, the marsupial lions, the diprotodons that once shared its landscape. It survived the arrival of Aboriginal Australians, with whom it developed a relationship over tens of thousands of years, featuring prominently in their art, their stories, and their diet. It survived European settlement, which was considerably more disruptive. It appears at this point to have survived the Australian military. The emu's tenure on this continent is so long, so continuous, and so impervious to the events of recorded history that the 1932 campaign reads, in geological time, as a minor scheduling conflict. The emu did not notice. The emu is still here. Now take a step back, further than before, not just away from the fields or the farmers or the reports and debates, but away from the entire timeline of human events. Let the details soften slightly. The dates blur. The names fade. And what remains is the land, Australia. Not as a country, but as a place. A continent shifting slowly over millions of years, moving almost imperceptibly across the surface of the earth. Long before wheat fields, before fences, before the idea of a government sending soldiers anywhere, this land existed in a very different state. And somewhere in that long quiet stretch of time the emu appears. Not exactly as it is now, perhaps. Evolution rarely works in such clean, recognizable forms, but close enough a large ground-dwelling bird built for movement, built for endurance, built to survive in a place where survival requires a certain kind of consistency. You might imagine it then. The same long legs, the same steady gait, moving across a landscape that looks familiar in some ways and entirely different in others. Around it, other animals exist, much larger ones, some of them, creatures that no longer walk this earth. Massive marsupials, predators with shapes that feel almost improbable now. And through all of that, the emu continues, not dominating, not competing in any dramatic sense, just persisting. Time passes, not in years, not in centuries, but in stretches so long they become difficult to hold in your mind. The climate shifts, the landscape changes, species appear and disappear, entire ecosystems rise and fall, and the emu, adapting quietly, remains. Eventually people arrive, not suddenly, not as a single event, but gradually. Aboriginal Australians, moving into the landscape tens of thousands of years ago, begin to interact with the world around them in ways that are both practical and deeply connected. The emu becomes part of that relationship. It is hunted, it is understood, it is woven into stories, into traditions, into a way of seeing the land that is not based on ownership, but on presence. And still, the emu continues. Then, much later, another arrival. European settlement. This is a different kind of change. Faster, more disruptive, structured around ideas that do not align easily with the rhythms of the land. Fences appear, fields are carved out, the landscape is reshaped to fit a different set of expectations. And into this new version of the same place, the emu walks, unaware that anything has fundamentally changed. The wheat fields, from its perspective, are simply another development, an unusually convenient one perhaps. Food arranged neatly in large quantities, water stored in accessible locations. The fences are new, but not insurmountable, and so the emu continues. Then comes 1932, a very specific moment, clearly defined, carefully recorded. A time when the interaction between human intention and natural movement becomes briefly concentrated into something that can be described, analysed, and eventually retold. The Great Emu War. From a human perspective, it is a notable event, unusual, memorable, something that stands out in the timeline precisely because it does not behave like other events. But from the perspective of the emu, it is almost nothing. A short disruption, a series of loud noises, a temporary increase in activity that does not alter the underlying pattern. The migration continues, the feeding continues, the movement across the land remains steady, uninterrupted in any lasting sense. If you stretch the timeline out far enough, the entire event becomes very small, a brief moment in a much longer story. And that, perhaps, is the quiet perspective this segment offers. Not to diminish what happened, not to dismiss the effort or the difficulty, but to place it within a scale where its edges soften slightly, where it becomes one of many interactions between humans and a landscape that does not fully bend to their expectations. The emu was here long before, it is here now, and, if nothing fundamental changes, it will continue to be here long after the details of 1932 have faded into something closer to a story than a memory. Still walking, still moving forward, in the same steady way it always has. Here is something that makes the entire episode funnier in retrospect, and it was already extremely funny. The emu is one of only 2 animals on the Australian coat of arms. It shares this honour with the kangaroo. Both animals were chosen, the story goes, because neither can walk backward, they can only move forward, making them symbols of a nation's commitment to progress and forward motion. The emu, symbol of Australian perseverance and forward momentum, was in 1932 the subject of a military campaign that the Australian military could not win. The emu on the coat of arms continued to face forward. The emus in the Campion district continued to move through the wheat fields in whatever direction felt most productive. The symbolism was not lost on everyone, though several members of Parliament clearly wished it were. Now imagine standing in front of that coat of arms, not as a symbol in a book, not as a small image on paper, but large, official, carefully designed. The kind of object that carries weight simply by existing. You look at it the way people are meant to look at symbols, with a quiet understanding that it represents something larger than itself. There it is, the emu, balanced opposite the kangaroo, both positioned with a kind of steady dignity. They are not moving, of course, this is a fixed image, but everything about their posture suggests motion, forward motion, purpose, a sense that they are part of something that continues steadily without hesitation. It is a good symbol, simple, clear, easy to understand, a nation moving forward, not looking back, progress, embodied in 2 animals that, quite literally, do not walk in reverse, and then, gently, you remember. 1932. The same animal, or at least a great many very similar ones, standing in a field looking at a machine gun with what can only be described as limited concern. There is a quiet contrast here. Not loud, not dramatic, just present. On the coat of arms, the emu represents forward movement, resilience, a kind of national character that values persistence and direction. In the fields of Western Australia, the emu represents something else. Not opposition, not resistance in the structured, intentional sense, but a kind of indifference to the structures being applied around it. The emu does not move forward because it is a symbol. It moves forward because that is what it does. Because there is something ahead. Because movement in that direction is simply the most reasonable option available. You might find yourself looking at the image again, the clean lines, the careful design, the way everything fits together into a coherent representation of identity, and then, just behind that image, there is another one, less organised, less intentional. A group of emus moving through a wheat field, adjusting their direction slightly to avoid something loud, then continuing on their way as though nothing particularly important has occurred. Both images are true. Both exist at the same time. One is a symbol, the other is a reality. And for a brief moment in 1932, those 2 versions of the same animal intersect in a way that is difficult to fully reconcile. Not contradictory exactly, just layered. Because the qualities that make the emu a suitable symbol, persistence, forward movement, resilience, are the same qualities that made it such a difficult problem to manage. The same steady, unhurried motion that looks admirable in a symbolic context becomes, in a field of wheat, something else entirely. Something that does not stop. Something that does not reconsider. Something that simply continues. There is no irony in the emu itself. It is not aware of its role, either symbolic or practical. It does not know that it has been chosen to represent anything. It does not know that it has, at one point, been the subject of military attention. It simply exists and moves forward. The irony, if there is any, exists entirely on the human side, in the way symbols are chosen, in the way meanings are assigned, in the way those meanings, when placed next to real events, occasionally produce something that feels quietly amusing, not in a loud, obvious way, but in the kind of way that lingers. You might imagine someone years later glancing at that coat of arms and remembering. Not the official explanation, not the intended symbolism, but that small, unusual moment when the animal depicted there became part of a story that did not quite follow the expected pattern. And then the moment passes, the symbol remains, the meaning remains, and out in the landscape, beyond the reach of design and intention, the emus continue their steady movement across the land, facing forward not because they represent progress, but because there is, quite simply, nowhere else they would choose to go. Major Meredith went on with his military career. He appears in later records as a respected officer involved in the Second World War. He is also, inevitably, the man who commanded the Emu War, and this followed him in the way that certain historical moments follow people, not with malice, but with the stubborn persistence of a good story. Sir George Pearce lost the nickname he had been given, the Minister for the Emu War, but not the memory. The farmers of the Campion district kept farming, kept lobbying, kept writing letters about fencing subsidies, and mostly kept losing the broader argument with an indifferent economy. They were real people having a hard time in a hard era, and the comedy of the Emu campaign was not comedy for them. It was one more thing that did not work, in a long list of things that had not worked. Now imagine the quiet after, not the immediate quiet of a paused operation, but the longer kind. The kind that settles in after the attention has moved elsewhere. After the newspapers have found new stories, after the debates have shifted to other topics, after the sense of urgency has faded into something more distant. Life continues. Major Meredith returns to his career. There are other responsibilities, other assignments, other moments that require his attention. The structure of military life provides a kind of forward movement, a sequence of duties that does not pause for reflection unless there is time to spare. And yet, somewhere in the background, the memory remains, not always present, not something he carries into every situation, but there, occasionally resurfacing, in a conversation perhaps, in a question asked years later, in a moment where someone recognizes his name and connects it quietly to that one unusual chapter, not in a way that diminishes his broader career, but in a way that attaches itself gently and stays. This is how certain stories work. They do not define a person entirely, but they do not leave either. Elsewhere, Sir George Pearce continues. The role, the responsibilities, the expectations of public life move forward as they always do. The nickname fades, as most things do over time, replaced by other concerns, other decisions, other moments that require explanation. But the memory remains, not in headlines anymore, not in active discussion, but in the quieter spaces where past decisions are remembered, considered, and perhaps understood a little differently with distance. And then there are the farmers, still there, because they never left. For them, there is no clear transition from one chapter to another, no moment where the story ends and something entirely different begins. Instead, There is a continuation, one season into the next, one attempt into another. They wake up, they work, they repair what needs repairing. They write letters when writing letters still feels like it might lead somewhere. They adjust their expectations slowly over time as the larger forces around them, the economy, the climate, the land itself, continue to shape what is possible. The emus are still part of this, not as a headline, not as a national story, but as a recurring presence. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but never entirely absent. Just another factor in a long list of factors that must be managed, endured, worked around. There is no clear resolution here. No moment where everything is fixed. Just a gradual shift toward methods that work better, solutions that are less visible but more reliable. Fences instead of machine guns. Patience instead of urgency. And through it all, the daily reality remains. You might imagine a farmer years later standing in the same field. The conditions are different, perhaps slightly improved in some ways, unchanged in others. The memory of the military operation lingers, not as something dramatic, but as something strange. A moment when the problem grew large enough to attract attention, and then, just as quickly, returned to its usual scale. It becomes a story. Not one told often, not one that changes the outcome of the day, but one that exists alongside everything else. Something to recall occasionally with a mixture of disbelief and recognition. Because for those who lived through it, the humour that others found in the situation was never quite the same. It was not a distant, amusing detail. It was part of a much larger pattern, a pattern of effort and uncertainty, of promises made and only partially fulfilled, of continuing, because continuing is the only option available. And so the people move forward, not in a symbolic sense, not as part of a larger narrative, but in the simple, steady way that life requires, one day into the next, with the land, the work and the quiet understanding that not every problem becomes a story worth telling, even if, occasionally it does. The Great Emu War is, at this distance, almost entirely comedic. The facts are so particular and so strange that they resist dramatization. Any attempt to make them more dramatic would make them less funny, and they are at their most powerful when presented exactly as they occurred. A government deployed soldiers against birds. The birds won. The soldiers went home. The government quietly stopped talking about it. The birds stayed. This is the complete arc of the event. What it left behind is something more interesting than a victory or a defeat. It left behind a story that has survived nearly a century because it contains something people find irresistible. It contains the image of a very large, very organized, very serious institution, the kind of institution that issues reports and holds debates and has a coat of arms, encountering something completely indifferent to all of that, and losing, politely, without anyone quite admitting it. Now let that settle, not as a punchline, not as something to laugh at directly, but as a quiet shape in your mind. A story that doesn't raise its voice, doesn't insist on attention, but remains there anyway, because it is simple and because it is strange. Over time, stories like this change. Not in their facts, those remain, written down, preserved in reports and records, but in how they are held. The sharp edges soften, the urgency fades. What was once a frustrating, complicated situation becomes something easier to carry. Something that can be told, retold, and eventually enjoyed. But it is not just humour that keeps it alive. There is something else underneath it, something quieter. You might notice it if you think about the structure of the story, not the details but the shape. Problem appears. A solution is applied. The solution does not work in the expected way, and instead of resolving cleanly, the situation simply continues. This is not how most stories are told. Most stories prefer endings, clear outcomes, a sense that something has been completed, that the arc has reached its natural conclusion. But this one resists that. It ends, yes, but not because the problem disappears. It ends because attention moves on, and the problem remains. There is something oddly comforting in that, because it reflects something familiar. Not every effort produces the result it was designed to produce. Not every system, no matter how structured or well-intentioned, aligns perfectly with the world it is trying to shape. Sometimes the thing being acted upon simply continues, unchanged in any meaningful way, and the response to that is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, a shift in approach, a step back, a gradual adjustment that is less visible, less satisfying in the moment, but more aligned with reality. The Great Emu War, in that sense, becomes more than just an unusual historical episode. It becomes a kind of gentle reminder that control has limits, that scale does not guarantee success, that persistence, when it appears in unexpected places, can be difficult to interrupt, and that sometimes the most effective response is not the one that feels the most decisive. You might imagine someone hearing this story for the first time, late at night perhaps, half listening at first, then gradually more attentive as the details unfold. There is a moment, somewhere in the middle, where it shifts from curiosity to something else, a recognition that this is not just an odd collection of facts, but a pattern that feels familiar in a way that is hard to explain. And then it ends, not with a dramatic conclusion, not with a final resolution, but with a kind of quiet acceptance. The soldiers leave, the government moves on, the emus remain, and the land continues exactly as it always has, holding all of it without preference. If you return to that landscape now, or imagine it as it is, there is no trace of the event in the ground itself, no marker, no sign that something unusual once took place here. The fields are fields, the sky is wide, the air moves slowly across the same open space, and somewhere out there, moving steadily, without urgency, without awareness of the story they have become part of, the emus are still walking. Forward, as they always have, as they always will. And now, without any announcement, without any formal conclusion, the story begins to settle. Not end, exactly. Just settle. You're no longer in the truck, no longer in the Parliament chamber, no longer standing in the fields, watching emus move through wheat with quiet determination. All of that has drifted slightly further away, like a memory that is still clear, but no longer immediate. What remains is the feeling of it, the shape of the story. Government tried something. The land responded in its own way. The emus continued, and somewhere in between those things a small, quiet understanding formed. You might notice how still everything feels now, not empty, just unhurried. The kind of stillness that comes after something has finished trying to be solved. The kind that does not ask for conclusions or summaries, but simply allows things to exist as they are, without needing to be arranged into meaning. The sky in your mind is still wide. It stretches outward in that familiar open way, holding nothing and everything at the same time. The air is warm, but no longer oppressive. The ground beneath it is quiet, settled into itself, unchanged by everything that has passed across it. And somewhere in the distance, not close enough to draw your focus, but not far enough to disappear completely, a few emus are still moving, slowly, steadily, not in response to anything, not because of anything, just because movement for them is simply what comes next. There is something calming about that. No urgency, no decision that needs to be made, no moment where everything depends on what happens next. Just a quiet continuation. You might find yourself following that movement for a moment, the way you would follow the path of a cloud or the gentle shift of light across the ground. Not because it leads anywhere, but because it doesn't need to. The story has already unfolded. Everything that needed to happen has happened. The attempts were made, the effort was real, the outcome was what it was. And now there is nothing left to push against, nothing left to resolve. That can be a strange feeling at first. We're used to endings that feel like endings, clear points where something stops, where a conclusion is reached and everything settles neatly into place. But this is not that kind of ending. This is softer, more like a quiet fading. The kind where the details don't disappear all at once but gently lose their sharpness. The edges blur slightly. The events become less important than the feeling they leave behind. A sense of scale, a sense of patience, a sense that the world is larger and slower and less concerned with outcomes than we sometimes expect it to be. You don't need to hold on to that. You can just notice it, and then let it rest. If you listen closely, there is almost a rhythm to it now. Not a sound exactly, but a pattern. The slow movement of something across open land. The quiet persistence of life continuing in its own way, without needing acknowledgement. And then even that begins to soften. The fields fade, the horizon dims slightly. The shapes that once felt clear and defined become gentler, less distinct. You're no longer watching anything. You're simply here. Nothing to follow, nothing to understand, nothing to keep track of. Just a quiet space where everything has already unfolded and there is nothing left to do. And that is enough. You can let the story go now. Let it drift away in whatever direction it chooses, the same way everything else has. No need to guide it. No need to finish it in any particular way. It will settle on its own, just like the land, just like the air, just like the slow, steady movement of something that never needed to stop in the first place. And as it fades gently, almost without you noticing, you can rest, and that is where we'll leave things tonight. Not with a victory, not with a defeat, just with a quiet landscape, a wide sky, and something out there still moving forward in its own steady way. If you made it this far, I hope your mind has slowed a little. Your thoughts have softened, and the world feels just a bit quieter than it did before. Wherever you are, whatever time it is for you, I'm really glad you were here with me for this strange little chapter of history. If you're still awake, feel free to let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel, and if you're already drifting off, then you're exactly where you're supposed to be. So for now, let everything settle, let the story fade, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.